May 8, 1945, Frankfurt, Germany. The spring morning dawned with an eerie quiet that seemed to mock the utter devastation surrounding what remained of the once proud city. Thin wisps of smoke still curled from blackened buildings as women with hollow cheeks and sunken eyes moved through streets littered with rubble, searching for anything that might sustain their families another day. They believed the American occupiers would be their final punishment, the vengeful conquerors coming to claim what little remained of their dignity. They couldn't have been more wrong. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how hunger became the battlefield, where ancient prejudices confronted unexpected compassion, and how the simple act of serving food first to those deemed least worthy would transform not just empty stomachs, but hardened hearts in the aftermath of history's most destructive war. Helga Müller clutched her ration card so tightly that her knuckles whitened. At 42, she looked 60, her once beautiful face now gaunt, her blue eyes dulled by years of deprivation. 6 years of war had stolen her husband, her home, and very nearly her hope. Now she stood in line outside the newly established American Food Distribution Center with 200 other desperate German women, all hoping for something more substantial than the meager portions they'd survived on under the crumbling Reich. "They say the Americans waste more food than we've seen in years," whispered Greta Hoffmann, a former schoolteacher whose clothes hung from her frame like laundry on a line. "Hans at the apothecary told me their soldiers receive chocolate and real coffee daily, and now they'll make us beg for scraps," said Margaret Weber, her voice bitter. The former nurse had lost both sons on the Eastern Front and carried her grief like armor. "After what they did to Dresden, Hamburg, do you think they'll show kindness to German women?" Helga remained silent. Speculation wasted precious energy, and she needed every ounce of strength to care for her 2 daughters, Frieda, 16, and Lotta, 12, waiting in their partially collapsed apartment. The girls hadn't had proper meat in 8 months. Lotta had forgotten the taste of butter. Inside the requisitioned school gymnasium that now served as displaced persons feeding station, number 17, Staff Sergeant Marcus Washington supervised his team as they prepared for the day's distribution. A 24-year-old from Meridian, Mississippi, Washington had joined the army to escape the suffocating racism of the American South, only to find himself fighting for a country that still relegated him and his men to support roles. The 32 12th Quartermaster Service Company was one of many all-black units handling the massive logistical operation of feeding both American troops and now, increasingly, the starving German civilian population. "Wilson, those potatoes need another 15 minutes. Johnson, start breaking down those crates of powdered milk. Davis, where are we on bread?" Washington moved with practiced efficiency, his tall frame commanding respect from his men, despite the larger military's relegation of black soldiers to service positions. 400 loaves ready to go, Sarge," answered Corporal Elijah Davis, a former baker from Chicago whose skills had proven invaluable, "and the K-ration supplements are sorted." "Captain's coming," murmured Private First Class Thomas Wilson, nodding toward the entrance where Captain Robert Miller, the white commanding officer of their sector's relief operations, strode in with his clipboard. Miller, a 40-year-old former history teacher from Connecticut, had initially approached his assignment to oversee the black quartermaster unit with the casual prejudice typical of the era. 6 months later, he'd developed a grudging respect for Washington's efficiency and professionalism, though he'd never admit it openly. "Status report, Sergeant," Miller said, glancing around the operation with practiced scrutiny. "Ready to commence at 0800, sir. We can process approximately 30 individuals every 15 minutes. Estimated supply will feed 500 today," Washington replied, standing at attention. Miller nodded. "New orders from command. We're implementing additional security measures. 2 MPs will be stationed at the entrance. Intelligence reports indicate some former Nazi officials are sending their wives to collect rations under false pretenses." "Understood, sir." Miller hesitated, then added, "There's also concern about potential hostility toward your men. These people have been subjected to years of propaganda. They've never seen Negro soldiers, certainly not ones in positions of authority." Washington's expression remained neutral. "My men are professionals, sir. We'll maintain appropriate military bearing regardless of civilian reactions." "See that they do," Miller said, then lowered his voice. "Some of these women have been through hell, Washington. Bombing, starvation, worse from the Russians in the east. Keep that in mind." "Always do, sir." Washington's voice revealed nothing of his thoughts on being lectured about compassion by a man who had never invited him to sit at the same table. As Miller departed, Corporal Davis moved to Washington's side. "Same old song, different verse," he muttered. Washington adjusted his uniform. "Focus on the job, not the nonsense. These people need food. We have food. Everything else is just noise." Outside, the line had grown. Helga stamped her feet against the morning chill, watching as 2 military policemen took position at the entrance. Rumors rippled through the queue. "They're checking for Nazi party connections," an elderly woman whispered. "My neighbor was turned away yesterday. Her husband was a minor official." "I heard they're taking young women for the soldiers," another voice added fearfully. Margaret scoffed. "Don't be ridiculous. The Americans aren't Russians." The doors opened precisely at 8. The MPs began processing women at the entrance, checking identification papers against their lists. Helga's heart raced as she approached, but they barely glanced at her documents before waving her through. The gymnasium's transformation shocked her. Neat tables lined with supplies, the organized efficiency, the abundance. It was staggering after years of increasing scarcity. But what froze her in her tracks were the men behind the serving tables. Black men in American uniforms, their dark skin a stark contrast to the olive drab they wore. Helga had seen propaganda images, of course, caricatures in Der Stürmer, films portraying black Americans as savage, primitive creatures. But these men moved with disciplined precision, their faces impassive and professional, as they directed the German women to form serving lines. "Sie müssen sich dort anstellen," a white officer instructed, pointing to the designated areas. "Form 3 lines." Confusion and hesitation rippled through the women. Some stood paralyzed, staring at the black soldiers. Others whispered urgently to each other. A few turned to leave. Staff Sergeant Washington observed the reaction with resigned familiarity. He'd seen it in French villages, Belgian towns, even in England. Initial shock, fear, curiosity, eventually followed by the realization that hunger outweighed prejudice. He'd learned to wait it out, to let the basic human need for sustenance overcome whatever had been taught or believed. Margaret Weber was the first to break the tension. "I didn't survive Dortmund's bombing to starve because of foolishness," she declared, marching toward the first serving station where Corporal Davis stood ready with bread rations. Slowly the other women followed, forming uneven lines. Helga found herself in Sergeant Washington's line, unable to meet his eyes as she approached the table. "Guten Morgen," Washington said, his accent thick but the effort evident. He'd learned basic German phrases, finding that this small courtesy often eased tensions. Helga glanced up, startled by the gentle tone. "Guten Morgen," she replied automatically. Washington checked her ration card, then began efficiently assembling her allotment: a loaf of bread, powdered milk, canned meat, dried beans, a small chocolate bar, and, most precious, a packet of real coffee. "Kaffee?" Helga couldn't help the question that escaped her lips, eyes widening at the sight of the brown packet. "Yes, ma'am. Coffee." Washington allowed himself a small smile. "First real shipment we've received for civilian distribution." As Helga accepted the parcel, their fingers briefly touched. She flinched involuntarily, then flushed with shame at her reaction. Washington's expression didn't change, his professionalism unbroken by her response. He'd experienced worse, far worse, even from his own countrymen. "Danke," she murmured, hurrying away with her rations. By noon, the initial shock had faded somewhat as hunger and pragmatism prevailed. The distribution continued with military efficiency, though the atmosphere remained tense with unspoken thoughts and ingrained prejudices. Private James Johnson, 20 years old from Harlem, manned the milk powder station. He'd been a promising student before the war, with dreams of attending college that now seemed distant. As he measured portions, he noticed a thin girl of about 16 standing off to the side, watching the proceedings without joining any line. "You see that girl by the wall, Sarge?" he asked Washington during a brief lull. "Been standing there for almost an hour." Washington glanced over. The girl was clearly underfed, her blonde hair limp, her posture suggesting exhaustion. "Maybe no ration card," he said. "Captain's strict about documentation." Johnson nodded, but kept watching the girl between serving women. When the flow temporarily slowed, he quickly assembled a small package, less than a full ration but enough for a meal, and slipped away from his station. Washington saw the movement. "Johnson," he called sharply, but the younger man pretended not to hear. Johnson approached the girl, who stiffened as he neared. "Fräulein," he said gently, offering the small bundle. "Essen?" "Food." Her blue eyes widened with fear, then hunger. She hesitated, looking toward the exit as if calculating whether to flee. "It's okay," Johnson said, knowing she probably didn't understand his words, but hoping his tone conveyed his meaning. "Just food." Slowly the girl reached out, snatched the package, and backed away several steps before stopping. Then, surprising Johnson completely, she gave a small curtsy before turning and running from the gymnasium. "That was Frida Müller," said a voice behind him. Johnson turned to find Helga, who had returned for the afternoon distribution to secure rations for her neighbor too ill to come herself. "My daughter. She has no ration card yet. The officials say there is confusion because our documentation was destroyed in the bombing." "Your daughter," Johnson repeated, surprised by the woman's direct communication. Helga's face showed the internal struggle. Speaking to this man as a human being contradicted everything the past 12 years of Nazi rule had taught. Yet he had shown kindness to her child when he had no obligation to do so. "Ja, she is 16, too proud to beg, but too hungry to stay away." Helga's eyes dropped. "I told her to wait outside. I did not know she came in." Washington had approached, his expression stern. "Private, return to your station now." "Yes, Sergeant," Johnson responded, moving quickly back to his position. Washington turned to Helga. "Ma'am, if your daughter needs rations, there are proper channels. We can't have unauthorized distributions." Helga was taken aback by his perfect German. "You speak our language well." "I studied in Berlin, 1936, before the war." Washington didn't elaborate on his time as part of a research exchange at Friedrich Wilhelm University, cut short when the political climate made it untenable for a black American student to remain in Germany. "I see," Helga said, though clearly she didn't fully comprehend how this had come to be. "I apologize for my daughter. We will obtain proper documentation. See that you do." Washington's tone remained professional but not unkind. "Your neighbor's ration card?" The encounter lingered in Helga's mind as she walked home, her bag heavy with precious food. The black soldier had studied in Berlin, had walked the same streets she once shopped on, perhaps sat in cafes where she had enjoyed Sunday afternoons in a different lifetime. It complicated the caricature, introduced an uncomfortable nuance to the simplistic view she'd accepted. In their damaged apartment, Frida was already preparing a small fire in their jury-rigged stove. The precious package from Johnson opened beside her. "Mutti, look! Real chocolate!" Lotte exclaimed, breaking the small bar into 3 precise pieces. Helga set down her rations. "You went inside the gymnasium," she said to Frida, "after I told you to wait outside." Frida's expression turned defiant. "I was careful. No one important saw me." "A soldier gave you food without documentation. That was dangerous for him and for us." "He was—" Frida hesitated. "He was kind, Mutti. He didn't have to be." Helga began unpacking the coffee with trembling hands. "We cannot afford complications, Frida. We are surviving on their mercy now." "Is it true what they say about the colored soldiers?" Lotte asked innocently. "Teacher Goebbels told us they were cannibals who ate children." "Lotte!" Helga's voice was sharp with shock and embarrassment. "We do not repeat such things." "But he said—" "Teacher Goebbels also said we were winning the war," Frida interrupted bitterly. "He lied about everything else. Why not this too?" Helga stared at her elder daughter, hearing dangerous thoughts that could have sent them all to camps just weeks earlier. Enough, she said firmly. We focus on survival now, not politics. That night, as her daughters slept, Helga sipped the precious real coffee, allowing herself this small luxury while contemplating the day's events. The black sergeant with his perfect German and Berlin education, the young soldier's kindness to Frida. These didn't align with everything she'd been taught to believe for years. Across the city in the repurposed hotel, serving as officers' quarters, Captain Miller was reviewing the day's distribution statistics with Washington. 487 civilians served, sir. We maintained an average processing time of 12 minutes per person after the initial adjustment period, Washington reported. Miller nodded. Any incidents? Washington hesitated. Private Johnson provided rations to an undocumented minor. I've addressed the breach of protocol. German girl. Yes, sir, approximately 16. The mother is properly registered and later identified her. Miller sighed. We're not in the business of starving children, Sergeant, documented or otherwise. But we need to maintain order. These people understand systems and protocols. Understood, sir. It won't happen again. See that it doesn't. Miller set aside his clipboard. How was the civilian response to your men? Washington's face revealed nothing. Initial hesitation, as expected. No verbal abuse or incidents. Good. Miller seemed genuinely relieved. I was concerned. The propaganda here was extensive. We're aware of the material, sir. Washington's tone was dry. The Nazi caricatures weren't substantially different from what he'd seen in certain American publications. Right? Well, Miller cleared his throat. Command is expanding civilian feeding operations. Starting next week, we'll add a second distribution period specifically for mothers with children under 10. Different ration composition, more milk, supplements. We'll adapt the rotation schedule. Sir? Miller nodded, then added somewhat awkwardly, Your men performed well today, Washington. They always do, sir. Washington's pride in his unit was evident despite his measured tone. Dismissed, Sergeant. Washington returned to the school where his unit was quartered in former classrooms. The men were playing cards, writing letters, maintaining equipment. Normal evening activities that would have looked familiar in any military unit, though these soldiers were restricted from entering the main areas of Frankfurt where white troops could freely go. How'd it go with the captain? Davis asked as Washington entered. Same as always, we did the job right, so he's surprised. Man's gonna strain something one day. Carrying around all that surprise at our basic competence, Johnson quipped, earning chuckles from the others. Washington sat heavily on his cot. Johnson, your little charity case today could have caused problems. The younger man looked down. Sorry, Sarge, but you saw her. Half-starved, scared to ask. There'll be a proper distribution for children starting next week. Until then, we follow protocol. Yes, Sergeant. Washington lowered his voice. These people don't know what to make of us yet. We can't give them any excuse to complain to command. One incident, one accusation, and they'll pull us out, replace us with white troops who won't give a damn if these civilians eat or starve. The men nodded soberly, understanding the precariousness of their position and the scrutiny they faced from all sides. Private Wilson, who rarely spoke about his pre-war life as a history teacher in a segregated Baltimore school, looked up from his letter writing. You know what gets me? Those women today looking at us like we're from Mars when Germany had African colonial subjects until after the Great War. There were black Germans right here until Hitler started his purges. They see what they've been trained to see, Washington replied, just like back home. Meanwhile, in a basement office of the partially destroyed Reichsbank building, Dieter Hoffmann reviewed the day's intelligence reports. Though officially just a civilian translator for the occupation forces, Hoffmann maintained connections to unrepentant Nazi elements still operating covertly. The 37-year-old former Gestapo officer had carefully scrubbed his record and identity, presenting himself as a politically neutral civil servant with valuable language skills. They're using Negro troops at the food distribution center on Goethestrasse, reported Werner Kleinschmidt, a former Hitler youth leader now working as a maintenance worker at several American facilities. Hoffmann's lips thinned with disgust. Deliberate humiliation, making German women accept food from subhumans. The people are too hungry to object, Kleinschmidt observed. My sister says the distribution is efficient, the rations generous. The Americans understand psychological warfare, Hoffman mused. First they bomb our cities to rubble, then arrive as saviors with food and chocolate. He made a note in his leather journal. Continue observation. Note any incidents, particularly interactions between these Negro soldiers and German women or girls. There is one development, Kleinschmidt added. A special distribution for mothers with young children is starting next week. Hoffman's eyes narrowed with sudden interest. Perfect. The maternal instinct overrides caution. We can use this. The next morning, Helga returned to the distribution center, this time with both daughters properly in tow. She had spent hours at the civil administration office, securing temporary documentation for Frida, determined to do things properly. The line was shorter today, the process already more familiar. Inside, she nodded respectfully to Sergeant Washington as she presented all 3 ration cards. Danke für Ihre Geduld, she said formally, thanking him for his patience with yesterday's situation. Washington verified the documentation. Alles in Ordnung, he confirmed, approving the rations for all 3. As Davis handed Frida her allotment, the girl glanced toward Johnson, who was focused on serving an elderly woman. Bitte danken Sie ihm für mich, she said quietly to Davis, asking him to thank Johnson for her. Davis smiled. I'll tell him. Lotta stared openly at the black soldiers, her child's curiosity uncomplicated by adult prejudices. You're not what I expected, she blurted out in German. Lotta, Helga scolded, mortified. Washington, understanding the girl's words, replied gently in German. What did you expect, Fräulein? The 12-year-old considered this seriously. Teacher Goebbels showed us pictures, but they didn't look like real people. You do. A moment of uncomfortable silence followed before Washington responded. Many pictures during war aren't real, on both sides. Helga hurried her daughters along, but the exchange left her thoughtful. Out of the mouths of babes came unfiltered truth. The propaganda images hadn't looked like real people because they weren't meant to. They were designed to dehumanize, to make it easier to hate what you were told to hate. As May stretched into June, the daily ritual of food distribution established a routine that began to normalize interactions between the German civilians and the black American soldiers. Small changes emerged. Women who had initially refused to make eye contact now offered tentative Guten Morgen greetings. Some brought handwritten notes with English phrases carefully copied from dictionaries. The soldiers responded with increasingly confident German phrases, creating a halting but functional communication. Captain Miller observed these developments with mixed emotions. His military assessment approved of the improved efficiency and reduced tension. His personal feelings were more complicated, shaped by his own upbringing in a segregated America. He'd been raised to believe in clear separation between races, yet here he witnessed daily evidence that such barriers were arbitrary constructs. The women seem less frightened of your men, he remarked to Washington during their weekly review. Hunger is a powerful motivator, sir, Washington replied evenly. It clarifies priorities. Miller frowned slightly. It's not just that. There's actual interaction happening. Fräulein Weber was attempting English with Corporal Davis yesterday. Is that a problem, sir? Miller shifted uncomfortably. Not officially, but maintain appropriate distance. These are still technically enemy civilians. Always do, sir. Washington kept his expression neutral, though inwardly he noted the irony. In Mississippi, he'd been warned to maintain appropriate distance from white women for entirely different reasons. The special distribution for mothers with young children began the following Tuesday. The gymnasium was rearranged to accommodate small ones, with a play area supervised by a Women's Army Corps officer, while mothers collected enhanced rations including canned milk, egg powder, and vitamin supplements. Staff Sergeant Washington had assigned his most personable men to this distribution, recognizing the importance of creating a non-threatening environment. Private Johnson, whose natural warmth made him popular with the children, managed the chocolate milk station, where each child received a cup while their mother collected rations. The little ones don't care what color hands give them chocolate, Johnson observed to Davis during a brief break. Funny how that works. Give it time, Davis replied cynically. They learn to care. Maybe not this time, Johnson said, watching a toddler happily showing her chocolate-stained fingers to her smiling mother. Maybe this time it's different. Helga had begun working as a translator at the Civil Administration Office, her pre-war secretarial skills and functional English making her valuable to the occupation authorities. The position came with enhanced rations and, more importantly, access to information about missing persons. She still maintained hope of learning her husband's fate after his last letter from the Russian front in 1944. Her co-worker, Margit Schneider, was scandalized by the Special Mother's distribution. "They say the Negro soldiers give candy directly to the children," she whispered during their lunch break, touching German children with their hands. Helga focused on her sandwich, real white bread with a thin scraping of butter, luxuries she'd forgotten during the war's final year. "The children seem happy enough," she observed neutrally. "Klaus says it's deliberate American policy," Margit continued, referring to her brother-in-law, who worked as a janitor at occupation headquarters, using their Negro soldiers to humiliate us, to show their dominance. "Perhaps," Helga said non-committally, unwilling to argue but increasingly skeptical of such interpretations. The black sergeant who spoke perfect German and had studied in Berlin before the war didn't fit the narrative of primitive soldiers being used as props in a humiliation ritual. That evening, as she walked home with her enhanced rations, Helga took a detour past the once grand Frankfurt Opera House, now partially rebuilt and serving as a recreation center for American troops. As she passed, the sound of piano music drifted through the open windows, rich, complex jazz that stopped her in her tracks. Through the window, she glimpsed Sergeant Washington seated at a battered, upright piano, his long fingers moving with fluid grace across the keys. Around him, other black soldiers nodded in appreciation or softly harmonized. The music was unlike anything in her experience, neither the classical compositions she'd enjoyed before the war, nor the martial marches that had replaced them under Nazi rule. This was something else entirely, joyful yet melancholy, structured yet free. Washington glanced up and noticed her standing outside. Their eyes met briefly through the window glass. Embarrassed at being caught eavesdropping, Helga hurried away, the strange, beautiful music following her down the rubble-strewn street. At home, she found Frieda engaged in earnest conversation with their downstairs neighbor, Johann Becker, a frail 60-year-old former university librarian who had somehow survived both Nazi scrutiny and Allied bombing by becoming nearly invisible. "Herr Becker was explaining American jazz to me," Frieda explained as Helga entered. "He had records before they were banned." "I had to hide them in the university archive," Becker said, his thin face animated by the subject, labeled as "examples of cultural degeneracy for academic study only." He chuckled wheezily. "The party officials never bothered to check what I was actually studying." "I heard some today," Helga said, surprising herself by sharing the encounter. "One of the American sergeants was playing piano. The Negro soldiers played jazz?" Becker's eyes widened with interest. "Of course, it's their music originally. Armstrong, Ellington, Basie, all geniuses, all banned here since 1933. "Which sergeant was it?" "Washington," Helga replied. "The tall one who speaks German." Becker nodded thoughtfully. "I would give much to hear real jazz again, played by those who understand it best." Later, after the girls were asleep, Helga found herself recalling the music, its complex emotions somehow capturing everything she felt about her demolished city, her uncertain future, her challenged beliefs. The hands that played those notes with such sensitivity were the same ones that measured out flour and beans for hungry Germans who had been taught to consider him subhuman. Somewhere in those contradictions, a new understanding was struggling to be born. As June blossomed into July, Frankfurt slowly transformed from a city of shell-shocked survivors to a community cautiously rebuilding. American bulldozers cleared rubble from main thoroughfares, provisional shops opened in the less damaged buildings, children played in the shadows of ruins. And at Feeding Station 17, the ritual of nourishment continued with evolving significance. Staff Sergeant Washington found himself inexplicably looking forward to Tuesdays and Thursdays, when Helga Müller's shift at the Civil Administration Office allowed her to collect rations during his distribution hours. Their interactions remained formally correct, rarely extending beyond necessary communication, yet he noticed subtle changes. She no longer avoided his gaze, Her Danke carried genuine appreciation rather than obligatory politeness. Once, when he included an extra chocolate bar for her daughters, she had actually smiled, briefly, guardedly, but unmistakably. "You got a thing for that German lady, Sarge?" Private Johnson teased one evening as they performed equipment maintenance. Washington's expression remained impassive. "Just doing my job, Private." "Uh-huh. That's why you're suddenly all concerned about who's manning the station on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Drop it, Johnson." Washington's tone closed the subject, but the younger man's observation lingered uncomfortably. Washington had survived by maintaining strict professional distance, from white officers' condescension, from German civilians' prejudice, from his own men's occasional resentment at his rigid adherence to regulations. Personal feelings complicated an already complex situation. Meanwhile, Dieter Hoffmann's network had been observing the feeding station operations with growing concern. The former Gestapo officer maintained detailed notes on the increasing comfort level between German women and black American soldiers. "It's working exactly as they planned," he told his small circle of confidants in the basement of a bombed-out church. "First hunger breaks down resistance, then gratitude creates vulnerability. Finally, fraternization establishes control." "The women have no choice," argued Kurt Weber, a former Wehrmacht supply officer. "They must feed their families." "There is always choice," Hoffmann countered coldly. "Our women are forgetting themselves, forgetting what these Americans did to our cities, our people. Especially troubling is how children are being influenced, accepting candy directly from Negro hands, learning their language." "What do you propose?" asked Werner Kleinschmidt. Hoffmann's thin smile didn't reach his eyes. "A reminder, something to restore proper distance between occupier and occupied." On July 12, 1945, the day began at feeding station that was 17 like any other. Washington's team had received a special shipment, including rare fresh fruit, actual oranges and apples, designated specifically for the children's distribution later that afternoon. First fresh fruit most of these kids will have seen in years, Davis observed as they arranged the precious cargo. "Captain says each child gets exactly one piece," Washington instructed. "We're expecting higher turnout than usual once word spreads." By noon, the line outside had indeed grown substantially, with mothers bringing children who hadn't previously attended distributions. Washington noticed an unusual number of men hovering at the periphery. Uncommon, as food collection had become primarily women's responsibility in the gender-imbalanced post-war population. "Eyes sharp today," he quietly instructed his team. "Something feels off." The distribution proceeded normally through the first hour. Helga arrived with both daughters, having secured special permission to leave work early when she heard about the fruit. 12-year-old Lotte bounced with excitement at the prospect of a real orange, a nearly mythical fruit she barely remembered from pre-war days. "Sergeant Washington says oranges have more vitamin C than 10 potatoes," she informed her mother seriously, having apparently absorbed nutritional information during previous distributions. Helga smiled at her younger daughter's untroubled acceptance of the black sergeant as an authority figure. "Is that so?" "He studied science in Berlin before the war," Lotte continued. "Frieda says he probably knows more than our teachers did." Helga glanced at her elder daughter, surprised by this information. Frieda shrugged slightly. "Johnson told me. They talk sometimes." The casual revelation that her teenage daughter had conversations with the young black private both concerned and intrigued Helga. Before she could respond, the gymnasium doors opened, and the distribution began. Inside, the atmosphere was lighter than usual, the children's excitement about fruit creating an almost festive mood. Washington personally supervised the fruit station, ensuring fair distribution of the limited supply. When Lotte reached him, her face lit up at the sight of the orange he placed in her small hands. "Ein Orange." "Danke, Sergeant Washington." Her thanks came with a spontaneous curtsy that made Washington smile despite himself. "You're welcome, Fräulein Lotte," he replied in German. "Do you remember how to peel it?" "I think so," she said uncertainly. "It's been a very long time." "Like this," Washington demonstrated with a spare orange, his large hands deftly removing the peel in a single spiral. It was a small kindness, an unscheduled moment of human connection. From the corner of his eye, Washington noticed Captain Miller observing the interaction with an unreadable expression. Immediately, Washington straightened, resuming his formal demeanor. "Next, please," he called, returning to efficient processing. As the afternoon distribution concluded, Washington was completing inventory when a commotion erupted outside the gymnasium. Shouts, then a woman's scream, followed by the distinctive sound of breaking glass. "Davis, secure the supplies," Washington ordered, heading for the door with Johnson and Wilson close behind. Outside, they found a cluster of German men surrounding a young mother who had just left the distribution. Her basket of rations lay scattered on the ground, the precious orange she'd received for her toddler crushed deliberately under a boot heel. "Collaborator!" one man shouted in German. "Taking food from subhumans, letting them touch your child!" The woman clutched her crying toddler, her face pale with fear, as the men closed around her. Other German women who had received rations stood frozen, uncertain whether to intervene or flee. "Break it up," Washington commanded in German, his authoritative voice cutting through the tension. "Disperse immediately." The German men turned, momentarily startled by the black soldier's appearance. Then one, a thin man with a face pitted by smallpox scars, sneered. "American lapdogs ordering Germans on German soil." "Military law is in effect," Washington responded evenly, though he could feel his pulse quickening. "Civilian harassment is prohibited. Disperse now." "Or what, Negro?" the man challenged, deliberately using the German equivalent of a racial slur. "Will you shoot women and children again, as you did in the bombing raids?" Washington maintained rigid control. "MPs have been called. Final warning." The standoff stretched for several tense seconds before Helga Müller unexpectedly stepped forward from the crowd of onlookers, positioning herself between Washington and the agitators. "Enough, Kleinschmidt," she said firmly to the pockmarked man. "You dishonor yourself. These people are feeding our children while you destroy food out of spite." "Careful, Frau Müller," Kleinschmidt warned. "People notice who keeps company with the occupiers." "People notice who steals food from children's mouths," she countered, then turned to the frightened young mother. "Come, Ingrid. My daughters and I will walk you home." The confrontation deflated as quickly as it had begun. The men dispersed before MPs arrived, disappearing into side streets with practiced ease. Washington helped gather the scattered rations, while Johnson produced a replacement orange from his pocket. "Against regulations," Washington murmured, seeing the unauthorized fruit. "Court-martial me," Johnson replied with a half-smile, handing the orange to the tearful toddler. As the German women departed in small protective groups, Helga paused. "They will try again," she warned Washington quietly. "There are those who cannot accept the world as it is now." Washington nodded. "Same on both sides of the ocean, ma'am." Their eyes met in a moment of shared understanding before she turned to join her daughters. Washington watched her go, aware that something significant had shifted. She had publicly taken a stand beside American soldiers, black soldiers, against her own countrymen. The implications would not go unnoticed in a community still navigating the collapse of one social order and the uncertain emergence of another. That evening, Washington reported the incident to Captain Miller, who frowned deeply at the description. "Organized resistance?" Miller asked sharply. "Unlikely, sir. Opportunistic harassment, probably former Nazi sympathizers." Miller made notes in his log. "I'll increase MP presence for the next few distributions. Can't have civilians intimidating each other." He hesitated, then added, "This German woman who intervened, Müller, was she one of the translators from civil administration?" "I believe so, sir." "Brave of her," Miller observed. "Not everyone would have the courage to break with community pressure like that." He studied Washington. "Your German helped diffuse the situation." "Thank you, sir." "Your men handled it well, showed restraint." Miller seemed to struggle with something before continuing. "Washington, I'm recommending your unit for commendation. The feeding program's efficiency statistics are the best in the Frankfurt area, and now you've demonstrated appropriate crisis management." Washington couldn't fully hide his surprise. "Thank you, sir. The men will appreciate the recognition." Miller nodded stiffly, then added, "The 3rd Infantry is rotating back to the States next month. They've requested experienced quartermaster personnel to accompany them. If you're interested, I could put your name forward." The offer stunned Washington. Transfer to a prestigious white infantry division would be a significant career opportunity, practically unheard of for a black non-commissioned officer. "I'll consider it, sir," he managed to reply, his thoughts immediately turning to his men. Would the offer extend to his entire unit, or was he being separated from them, rewarded individually while the system remained unchanged? Later that night, unable to sleep, Washington slipped away to the recreation center, where the battered piano offered solace. His fingers found melodies that expressed what words couldn't, the contradictions of fighting for a country that denied him basic dignity, of protecting German civilians who had only recently considered his existence an abomination, of feeling unexpected connection with a woman whose society had been built on hatred of difference. He was so absorbed in the music that he didn't notice the figure watching through the window until he finished a melancholy rendition of Body and Soul. Looking up, he was startled to see Helga standing outside, just as she had weeks earlier. This time, however, she didn't flee when their eyes met. After a moment's hesitation, she gestured questioningly toward the door. Washington's first instinct was caution. A black sergeant alone with a German woman could create exactly the kind of situation he'd spent his military career avoiding. Yet something compelled him to nod slightly, granting permission. Helga entered hesitantly, her usual confidence diminished by the irregularity of the situation. "Forgive the intrusion, Sergeant. I was delivering documents to the headquarters and heard the music. It's fine, ma'am, just practicing." Washington remained seated at the piano, maintaining proper distance. "You play beautifully," she said, remaining near the door. "What was that piece?" "Body and Soul, the jazz standard. Herr Becker, my neighbor, speaks of jazz with great reverence. He had recordings before they were banned." Washington nodded. Many German music scholars appreciated jazz before the Reich decided it was degenerate. A brief silence fell before Helga spoke again. "I wanted to thank you for your handling of the situation today. It could have escalated badly." "Just doing my job, ma'am." "No," she said with unexpected firmness. "Many would have responded with force or anger. You showed restraint and dignity when provoked with deliberate disrespect." Washington's expression remained neutral, though her words affected him more than he cared to admit. "Your intervention was the decisive factor. That took courage. Perhaps," she acknowledged, "or perhaps just weariness with hatred." She gazed around the room, her eyes lingering on the makeshift stage where the soldiers had created a performance space. "My husband played violin, before the war, before everything." The personal revelation surprised Washington. "Is he missing? Eastern Front. No word since December 1944. Her voice held the flat acceptance of one who had learned to live with uncertainty. "Each day I check the new lists of prisoners returning from Russia. Each day nothing." Washington nodded, understanding the limbo she inhabited, not quite widowed, not quite waiting, suspended between grief and hope. "May I ask you something, Sergeant?" Helga's tone shifted, becoming more direct. "Why do you treat us with such correctness? After what my country did, what we believed?" Washington considered the question carefully. "Because dehumanizing others is what caused this," he finally said, gesturing toward the window where the ruined skyline of Frankfurt was visible in the summer twilight. "I won't participate in that cycle, no matter who the target is. Even when you've been its victim? Especially then. I know exactly what it costs." His fingers absently played soft chords as he spoke. "My father taught music in Mississippi. He used to say that bitterness is drinking poison and expecting the other person to die." Helga absorbed this, then said quietly, "Your men have been kind to my daughters, particularly the young one, Johnson, Frida." She hesitated. "Frida has had few reasons to think well of any men since the Russians passed through our evacuation area last year." The implication hung heavily in the air. Washington nodded, understanding without requiring elaboration. The war had left no innocence intact, had violated boundaries both national and personal. "Johnson's a good man," Washington said, "planned to be a teacher before the war. And you? What were your plans before all this?" The personal question would have normally triggered Washington's professional withdrawal, but something about the quiet intimacy of the moment, the shared understanding of loss, lowered his usual defenses. "Graduate studies in biochemistry," he answered. "I was at Howard University when Pearl Harbor happened, enlisted the next day." "You'll return to this after the war?" Washington gave a short, humorless laugh. "The America I'm returning to isn't eager to see black scientists, Ma'am. More likely I'll be teaching high school mathematics somewhere that will tolerate my presence." Helga frowned. "But surely your military service changes very little." He shifted on the piano bench. "Your country had its racial theories. Mine has its practices, different methods, similar outcomes." The stark assessment hung between them before Helga spoke again. "When I first saw you and your men, I was afraid," she admitted. "Everything I'd been taught said you were dangerous, primitive, less than human. Then I watched you organize complex distribution systems, speak multiple languages, play music that sounds like mathematics and emotion combined." She shook her head slightly. "It makes me question what else I accepted without thought." "That's the first step toward something better," Washington said quietly. "Questioning what we've been taught to believe without evidence." A clock somewhere chimed 11, breaking the moment. Helga straightened. "I should go. My daughters will worry." Washington nodded, rising respectfully. "Would you like an escort? The streets aren't entirely safe after curfew." "No, thank you. I have a night pass from civil administration, but I appreciate the offer." At the door, she paused. "Sergeant Washington, if you would consider it, Herr Becker would very much like to hear you play sometime. He's too frail to come here, but perhaps—" The invitation to a German home hung unfinished, its significance clear to both of them. "That would be complicated, ma'am," Washington replied carefully. "Yes, everything is now." She offered a small smile. "Gut Nacht, Sergeant." "Gut Nacht, Frau Müller." After she left, Washington remained at the piano. Playing softly until dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. The music helped organize his thoughts, process emotions he typically kept carefully contained. Something was happening in Frankfurt, not just between individuals, but within the collective understanding of who people were and could be to each other after the artificial barriers of prejudice began to crumble. The following week brought scorching July heat that intensified the smells of a city still clearing rubble and bodies. At feeding station Arbor 17, Washington's team worked in sweat-soaked uniforms, the gymnasium becoming stifling by midday. Despite the discomfort, distribution numbers reached record levels as rumors spread about a special shipment of canned fruit and ice for the children's rations. True to his word, Captain Miller had increased security, with MPs now regularly patrolling the area around the gymnasium. There had been no further incidents, though Washington noticed fewer men in the vicinity, not an absence of potential troublemakers, he suspected, but rather a tactical retreat, while they planned something more organized. On Thursday afternoon, with the temperature reaching 95 degrees Fahrenheit, the mother's distribution was in full swing when Private Wilson approached Washington with concern. "Sarge, the ice is melting faster than we can distribute it. Another hour and it'll be water." Washington made a quick calculation. "Adjust the schedule. Process the mothers with youngest children first, infants and toddlers priority." "That'll put some women who've been waiting hours at the back of the line," Wilson cautioned. "Can't be helped. Better some children get actual ice than everyone get water." Washington turned to the interpreter, a young German woman named Greta. "Announce the protocol change. Explain the reason clearly." Greta nodded and moved to the front of the room, explaining in German that due to the heat, mothers with the youngest children would now be served first to ensure babies and toddlers received properly chilled formula and fruit. A murmur of discontent rippled through the waiting women. Most accepted the logic, but a few protested having their long wait extended. Washington understood their frustration. Standing for hours in sweltering heat only to be told to wait longer would test anyone's patience. As the reorganization began, he noticed Helga and her daughters near the middle of the original line. By the new system, 16-year-old Frieda and 12-year-old Lotte would place them at the back of the priority list. Helga seemed to realize this, explaining quietly to her clearly disappointed daughters. What happened next would later be described differently by various witnesses, but all accounts agreed on the essential sequence. As the youngest children were brought forward, a woman carrying infant twins suddenly found herself at the front of the line. Exhausted from heat and the double burden, she stumbled slightly. Sergeant Washington, standing nearby, instinctively reached out to steady her, one hand supporting her arm while the other helped secure the precarious hold she had on one of her babies. The touch was brief, professional, and necessary, yet it crossed the invisible boundary between black soldier and German mother that even the liberalized atmosphere of the feeding station had largely maintained. A hush fell over the crowd, the moment suspended in collective awareness of a line being crossed. The young mother, perhaps 19 years old, looked up at Washington with initial shock, then unexpected gratitude. "Danke," she said simply, regaining her balance. Washington nodded professionally and stepped back, immediately returning to his supervisory position. But the interaction had been witnessed by everyone present, its significance registering differently across the various divides of rank, race, nationality, and personal history. Captain Miller, making one of his periodic inspections, had seen it from the entrance. His expression tightened momentarily before deliberate neutrality replaced it. Several German women looked away, uncomfortable with the direct physical contact between black soldier and German mother. Others watched with cautious curiosity. And Helga Müller, from her position mid-queue, felt something shift in her understanding of the world. The simple, humane gesture, a strong hand preventing a mother and child from falling, suddenly illuminated the absurdity of every barrier constructed to separate human from human. As the reorganized distribution continued, Washington maintained rigorous professionalism, hyper-aware of Miller's presence, and the heightened scrutiny following the incident. When Helga finally reached the front, among the last served due to her daughter's ages, she met his eyes with new awareness. "Water only left, I'm afraid," Washington said formally, nodding toward the melted ice. "The children's fruit is still chilled, however." "Thank you, Sergeant," Helga replied with equal formality, though something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, of shared humanity stripped of artificial categorization. Later that evening, Washington was summoned to Captain Miller's office. He arrived precisely at the appointed time, uniform impeccable, despite the persistent heat. "Sergeant Washington reporting as ordered, sir." Miller looked up from his paperwork, his expression uncharacteristically troubled. "Close the door, Sergeant." Washington complied, then stood at attention, bracing for what he expected would be a reprimand for the physical contact with the German mother. "At ease," Miller said, then sighed heavily. "I've received intelligence reports that concern your unit." This wasn't what Washington had expected. "Sir?" "There's an organized group of former Nazi officials operating in Frankfurt. Nothing militarily significant, but they're focusing on creating incidents around the feeding stations, particularly targeting the interactions between your men and German civilians." Washington absorbed this. The confrontation last week. Apparently just a test run. They're planning something more substantial, possibly during next week's distribution. "We can increase security measures." "Sir?" Miller shook his head. "It's not that simple. They're specifically exploiting the racial element, spreading rumors that Negro soldiers are being deliberately placed in food distribution to humiliate German women." Washington's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I see, sir." Miller looked uncomfortable. "Headquarters is concerned about potential incidents that could inflame tensions, just as we're establishing stability. They've ordered rotation of personnel at all feeding stations." The implications were immediately clear. "They're removing my unit from distribution duty." "Yes." Miller couldn't quite meet Washington's eyes. "Effective Monday. You'll be reassigned to warehouse operations at the main depot. White personnel will take over the feeding stations." Washington maintained rigid control over his expression, though internally he felt a familiar, bitter disappointment. Once again, the system would accommodate racism rather than confront it. "Is that all, sir?" Miller finally looked directly at him. "For what it's worth, Washington," I argued against this, "your unit's performance has been exemplary. This isn't about your conduct or capabilities." "It never is, sir," Washington replied evenly. "Permission to inform my men?" Granted. Miller hesitated, then added, "The transfer opportunity I mentioned, to accompany the 3rd Infantry stateside, it's still available. For you specifically." The implied separation from his unit hung in the air between them. "I'll remain with my men, sir," Washington said without hesitation. Miller nodded, seeming unsurprised. "Dismissed, Sergeant." Washington returned to quarters and informed his men of the reassignment. Their reactions ranged from resigned acceptance to bitter anger. "So we do the job right. And they take it away because some Nazi sympathizers complain," Johnson said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "What about the women and kids we've been helping? They just supposed to accept whatever replacement they get." "We follow orders, Private," Washington replied firmly. "The mission continues even if our role in it changes." "It's just like back home," Davis observed quietly. "Change the players but keep the game the same." Washington had no counter-argument to offer. He simply said, "We have 3 more distribution days. We'll maintain our standards until the last ration is handed out." Word of the unit's reassignment spread quickly through Frankfurt's recovering community networks. On Monday morning, Washington arrived at the gymnasium to find a longer-than-usual line already formed, despite the early hour. As the doors opened, he was surprised to see many women carrying small packages or tokens along with their ration cards. Helga Müller stood near the front, her expression determined as she approached Washington's station. Beside her ration card, she placed a carefully wrapped parcel. "What's this?" Washington asked, reverting to English in his surprise. "A small gift of appreciation," she replied, also in English. "From my family, to thank you for your service these past months." Washington hesitated, protocol warring with courtesy. "Ma'am, we're not permitted to accept gifts from civilians. It is not payment, Sergeant. It is acknowledgement." She met his eyes directly. "We have heard your unit is being reassigned." News traveled fast in a community rebuilt on information exchange. "That's correct. This is our final distribution week." Helga nodded, her expression revealing her understanding of what remained unspoken, the real reason for the reassignment. "Then perhaps you will accept this as a farewell token, from one human being to another." Washington glanced at Captain Miller, who stood near the entrance observing the proceedings with an unreadable expression. Then, making a decision, he accepted the small package. "Thank you, Frau Müller." Throughout the day, similar scenes repeated as German women, some who had initially refused to meet the eyes of black soldiers, others who had gradually developed cordial relationships over months of daily interaction, presented small tokens of appreciation. Hand-knitted handkerchiefs, carefully preserved pre-war postcards, paper flowers crafted by children, even precious family recipes written out in painstaking English. Each gift represented a small rebellion against the artificial divisions that systems of power maintained for their own purposes. Each acknowledgement was a tiny reclamation of individual humanity in defiance of collective categorization. By afternoon, the atmosphere in the gymnasium had transformed from the efficient but impersonal distribution center of months past to something approaching a community gathering. Children who had overcome initial fearfulness now chatted comfortably with the soldiers who had provided their first taste of chocolate in years. Women who had once flinched at the proximity of black hands now engaged in basic conversation, using memorized English phrases or working through interpreters to express appreciation. When the final ration had been distributed, Washington stood before the empty supplies, surveying the gymnasium that had been the center of his professional life for months. Captain Miller approached, his expression suggesting internal conflict. "Quite a send-off your men received today," he observed neutrally. "Yes, sir. Headquarters won't like it. Fraternization concerns." Washington met his gaze directly. "With respect, sir, I don't believe there's a regulation against gratitude." Miller almost smiled. "No, I suppose not." He extended his hand, an unprecedented gesture across the racial divide of military hierarchy. "It's been an education serving with you, Sergeant Washington." Washington accepted the handshake, recognizing the significance of this small act of equality. "Likewise, sir." That evening, after securing the gymnasium for the final time, Washington found himself drawn once more to the battered piano at the recreation center. As he played, working through complex emotions through music. He was only half surprised when Helga appeared at the door, this time accompanied by her daughters and the frail figure of Herr Becker supported between them. "Forgive the intrusion, Sergeant," she said, "but Herr Becker wished very much to hear you play before your reassignment takes you elsewhere." The old librarian's eyes lit with appreciation as Washington nodded permission for them to enter. "The last time I heard live jazz was 1933, Becker said, his voice thin but eager. "Louis Armstrong in Berlin, before the madness consumed everything beautiful." Washington adjusted the piano bench. "Any requests, sir?" "Duke Ellington, perhaps? Mood Indigo?" Washington smiled, his first genuine smile in days, and began to play, the melancholy notes filling the empty recreation room. As the music flowed, Frida helped Becker to a chair, while Lotta watched with undisguised fascination. Helga stood quietly, her eyes reflecting complex emotions, as the beautiful music created by the Black American sergeant washed over them all, connecting them across boundaries of nationality, experience, and history. When he finished, the small audience applauded with genuine appreciation. Becker had tears in his eyes. "Music reminds us of our common humanity," the old man said. "When I hear you play, Sergeant, I hear not a color or nationality, but a gifted human soul speaking through your instrument. High praise, sir, thank you." Lotta, with a child's directness, asked, "Will you come back to visit us after your new assignment?" Washington glanced at Helga, whose expression suggested she recognized the impossibility, even as she left space for gentle truth. "Military duties don't usually allow for social visits, Fräulein Lotte," he explained kindly. "That's what adults always say when the real answer is no," the girl replied with surprising perception. Washington acknowledged her insight with a nod. "You're right. The honest answer is that different rules apply to men like me. Even in victory, some boundaries remain uncrossed." "That's stupid," Lotta declared with childish certainty. "You gave us food when we were hungry. You're teaching me English words. Mutti smiles more since we started coming to your gymnasium. Why should there be different rules for you?" "Lotta," Helga cautioned, though her expression suggested agreement with her daughter's assessment. "It's a fair question," Washington conceded. "Unfortunately, the world is built on artificial divisions that benefit those who create them." "The world can change," Frida spoke for the first time, her quiet certainty carrying the weight of one who had seen both the worst and unexpected kindness in humanity. "It already has." Washington studied the teenager, recognizing the wisdom born of suffering and resilience. "Yes, it has, and will continue to, through people who question what they've been taught to accept." As the impromptu concert continued, with Washington playing requested melodies and explaining jazz techniques to the enthusiastic Becker, Helga moved to stand beside the piano, speaking quietly while the others were engaged in conversation. "I never thanked you properly," she said softly. "Not just for the rations, but for treating us with dignity when you had every reason not to." "No one should be judged by the worst actions of those who look like them," Washington replied. "That principle applies in all directions." "A wisdom my country forgot," Helga acknowledged. "One I forgot until hunger forced me to see beyond what I'd been taught." She hesitated, then asked, "What was in the package I gave you? You never opened it." Washington smiled slightly. "I will when the time is right." Later that night, alone in his quarters, Washington carefully unwrapped Helga's gift. Inside, he found a small, worn book of Goethe's poems in German, with English translations, clearly a treasured pre-war possession. A folded note fluttered from between the pages. "Music and poetry speak when ordinary words fail," she had written in careful English. "Thank you for helping us hear humanity in each other again. H.M." 3 days later, Washington's unit processed their final distribution at the gymnasium. The line of women and children stretched around the block, many waiting hours in the summer heat, not for the critical rations they'd once desperately needed, but for the opportunity to say farewell to the men who had treated them with unexpected dignity during their most vulnerable moments. Helga arrived in mid-afternoon with both daughters. As they reached Washington Station, Lotta impulsively extended a childish drawing, the gymnasium rendered in crayon. with stick figures of various colors standing together around tables of food. "So you remember us," she explained seriously. "I will remember," Washington promised, carefully accepting the artwork. "Danke, Fräulein Lotte." "Bitte, Sergeant Washington," she replied, her pronunciation carefully practiced. Frida, typically reserved, surprised everyone by addressing Private Johnson directly. "My mother says you wanted to be a teacher," she said in halting English. "You would be a good one." Johnson's face registered surprise before breaking into a genuine smile. "Thank you, Fräulein, maybe someday." As Helga accepted the final ration allotment, she met Washington's eyes. "Sergeant," she said formally, but with unmistakable emotion, "on behalf of many here, thank you for serving us first before judgment, before politics, before history. It taught us something essential that we had forgotten." Washington maintained his professional demeanor, though his voice carried sincerity as he replied, "It has been an honor to serve, Frau Müller." As the final women received their rations, an unexpected moment transformed the routine distribution into something altogether different. Margarete Weber, the former nurse who had lost both sons and whose initial bitterness had exemplified the walls between occupier and occupied, approached Washington Station last. The stern-faced woman, who had gradually progressed from hostile silence to reluctant acceptance to cautious respect over months of interaction, presented her ration card with uncharacteristic hesitation. Then, to the astonishment of everyone present, including Captain Miller, observing from his usual position, she spoke in careful, practiced English. "My sons died fighting your country," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I blamed all Americans. I believed what we were told about you, people like you." She struggled to maintain composure. "But you fed us when we were hungry. You treated us with more dignity than our own leaders did at the end. This I will remember." Then, in a gesture that broke every social boundary established by years of propaganda and centuries of prejudice, she extended her hand to Washington, not in the supplicant's position of receiving rations, but as one human being acknowledging another across the artificial divides of race, nationality, and history. Washington, recognizing the profound significance of the moment, accepted the handshake with appropriate gravity. "Thank you, ma'am," he said simply. What began with one woman's gesture spread through the gymnasium as other German women, some weeping openly, formed a line to shake hands with the Black American soldiers who had nourished them and their children through the desperate early months of occupation. Not all participated, some still bound by deeply ingrained prejudice or fear of community judgment, but enough joined that the symbolic breaking of barriers became the day's defining moment. Captain Miller watched the unprecedented scene, his expression revealing his struggle to reconcile what he witnessed with his own cultural conditioning. After several minutes, he approached Washington. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "headquarters would have a collective heart attack if they saw this." "Yes, sir," Washington agreed. "Fortunate they're not here to witness it." Miller studied him for a long moment, then said something Washington would remember for decades to come. "Some changes happen in official declarations from command. Others happen in gymnasiums and food lines, one handshake at a time. I'm beginning to think the second kind might matter more." 1 month later, Staff Sergeant Marcus Washington supervised warehouse operations at the Frankfurt Supply Depot, his unit's reassignment proceeding without incident. The daily interaction with German civilians had ended, the brief window of transformation closing as systems reasserted their familiar patterns of separation. Yet something had changed irrevocably in Frankfurt's feeding station, Darfation 17. The white soldiers who replaced Washington's unit found themselves measured against the standard of respectful treatment established by their predecessors. German women who had experienced being served first, being recognized as hungry humans rather than defeated enemies, carried that knowledge forward as they rebuilt their community and reconsidered what they would teach their children. On his final day in Frankfurt, before rotating back to the United States, Washington received an official package from civil administration. Inside was a formal letter of appreciation signed by dozens of German women, including Helga Müller, Margarete Weber, and many others who had passed through the gymnasium during those transformative months. Accompanying the letter was a book, a carefully assembled collection of children's drawings, recipes shared by grateful mothers, and photographs of the feeding station in operation. The inscription, written in Helga's neat hand, read, "When history is written by the victors, may they remember that the true victory came not from force of arms, but force of example. You served us first, before yourselves, before politics, before prejudice. In doing so, you nourished not just our bodies, but our capacity to recognize humanity across all constructed divisions. This is the seed from which a better world may grow." Washington carefully packed the book among his few personal possessions. Whatever awaited him in post-war America, he would carry this evidence that walls between humans are built, not born, and what is built can be dismantled, one meal, one handshake, one recognition at a time. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.